At 2:30, so I am going to start the recording. So as a reminder, everyone, this meeting will be recorded. I want to thank Pheasants Forever for continuing to partake and share some of the knowledge with us. And without further ado, I will pass it over to Maddie Cobbs, who will be talking about prairie establishment today.
Awesome. Thanks, Ian. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay. Alrighty. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this week's installation of the CRP Myth Busting webinar series. So we're going to do this pretty much like usual. I'll go through some slides. We'll have some time to chat. Feel free to ask any questions at the end. We'll have some discussion. But yeah, feel free to pop your questions in the chat if you have any. I think Scott's going to be moderating the chat. And also a heads up, there are a couple times where I'll ask for some feedback. So there should be a little react button up above in the right-hand corner of your screen. If you want to give me a thumbs up, if you know where that button is, just so I know it works and I can see people's feedback. All right, and I can. So, okay, yeah, I can see it, people, I guess. Sounds good. Well, yeah, and one more note, I am gonna turn my camera off because I get pretty distracted when I see my little image in the corner. So, before we dig in, here is a little bit about me. So I'm the Farm Bill biologist based out of Menominee. I cover Barron, Dunn, Pepin, and Buffalo. I've been with Pheasants Forever for a little over 6 months now. My favorite CRP practice is a Monarch 25. The vegetative diversity provides some really excellent quality habitat, and it's fun to customize these seed mixes. I also think they're the most fun to do status reviews on, just because you can sometimes see some fun new species. And my favorite find on a CRP status review was I did a site visit in St. Croix and came across a whole bunch of cardinal flower. It's not even that rare. It's a little bit rarer to find them in CRP, but it's just one of my favorites. Oop, skipped a slide here. So just a quick recap on the role of your Farm Bill biologist. We're here to accelerate enrollment into Farm Bill programs and to provide any technical assistance to enhance your habitat projects. And here's a map of the contact information for your Wisconsin Farm Bill biologist. This should be updated as of last week. So I'll hover for a second here. I think Anna, so in section 4 in central Wisconsin, is our most recent hire. That should be the only change. We can post this in the chat later. Alrighty, so let's get into the meat and potatoes on how to make the magic happen when it comes to establishing prairies. But first, let's just recap on some prairie fundamentals. So a prairie is a diverse plant community comprised of grasses, legumes, shrubs, and forbs. And in Wisconsin, a typical prairie has about 6 species per square foot. So that's quite a lot, especially compared to, like a lawn, which might have 1 or 2. In remnant prairies, which are areas of land that were prairie prior to colonial settlement, so in remnant prairies, those can harbor up to like 80 species an acre. So a lot of diversity. Today, I'm really just going to focus on prairie restoration since that's what we all do with CRP. And by definition, prairie restoration is the art and science of reconstructing a diverse native plant community. So it's pretty hard to make an exact copy of a remnant tallgrass prairie, but we can mimic a natural undisturbed prairie using a seed mix with the same components. And we can also adapt it to the restoration site. And then this vegetative diversity, it then provides habitat and food for our wildlife and our native insects. And of course, there's a whole bunch of other conservation benefits. We get reduced erosion, improved water quality, improved soil health, and carbon sequestration. So here's our first little reaction. If you can give me a thumbs up if you're feeling pretty good on some of these botanical terms. Um, Thumbs down if you could use like a 30-second refresh. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up here. I think I'll move on from these. These are pretty standard. I'm pretty sure we're all good on grasses because Britta did a really good job with her presentation on that. So our next reaction here, the difference between cool season versus warm season grasses. Again, this is probably review just for people who missed Britta's presentation on grasses, but thumbs up if you're feeling really good on the difference between these, and thumbs down if you could use some refreshing.
I will say, I don't think we have a thumbs down option. We can do a
Oh,
thumbs up, a heart. We can clap our hands, laugh, or be surprised.
oh, okay, sound good. Well, let's do a clap then if you want to. Thanks, Ian, for pointing that out. A clap option if you could want a refresher. Oh, yeah, I am seeing some. Okay, so I'll quickly go over the difference between these. The majority of our native plants and prairies, they are these warm season ones. We do have a few native cool season, but warm season plants, they do most of their growth in the hot summer months. So from late June through early September. And these plants don't really even start making any green material until air temperatures reach about 60 degrees. And they're really peaking more at like 85. Whereas cool season, on the other hand, they're producing biomass more in the spring, so like April through June. And this is a really good diagram. You can kind of see, so on the left here, these cool season grasses, they're doing that early flush of they green up in the spring, and there might be some peaking later on in the season as well. But there's really that stark peak with the warm season grasses in the summer. And just a reminder too that a lot of our natives are in this warm season component. So we're really fighting the cool season in some of our native prairie restorations. All right, so what does a restoration involve? So the steps are a little bit outlined here, kind of a broad overview of what goes into one. So initially, we have to assess the site conditions and build the plan for the project. So what are the characteristics of the site? What do we want to achieve with our project? And then the next stage is commonly referred to as site prep. I think our CRP cost share codes have it listed as like seed bed preparation. So this involves removing any existing weeds and preparing the seed bed. The next step is the planting itself. And then once the seed is in the ground, the landowner has to do some weed abatement to allow the desirable vegetation to outcompete those weeds that are going to want to pop up in the first couple years. And then once the prairie is established, we need some long-term management to keep it prairie, keep out the woody species, keep out the weedy species. All right, I'll go over some considerations with assessing the site. So one of the big factors to consider when planning a planting is the soil type and moisture regimes. So prairies are divided into about 5 soil moisture regimes. So we've got anything from wet to mesic, somewhere in the middle, to dry. And there's not really a sharp division between these. It's more of a gradient. But some plants are restricted to a certain one of these. So you might find a species only in wet prairie, while others, they can tolerate several of these, if not all of these conditions. And just a note here that wet organic soils are often the most challenging to establish native prairie on. There's just a lot of competition from those cool season grasses and from invasives. A lot of our natives, they're way better adapted to those hot, dry conditions. So it's really in that environment where they're outcompeting the weeds. Additionally, wet soils can pose some challenges with site prep and planting. It's just pretty difficult sometimes to get equipment in to do stuff. And these steps are really critical for a successful planting. So if you have one of these projects, might need some extra flexibility, some additional considerations when planning these. And then obviously, like Technical service providers select the actual seed mix, but we do this based on the soil types and the moisture regime. So there's a lot of seed mix requirements to consider. The criteria, of course, changes depending on the CRP practice. So maybe we're doing a basic prairie planting, maybe we're doing a restoration of a rare and declining community, maybe it's a pollinator planting. But one common factor we look at for meeting these criteria is making sure that we're looking at pure live seed, which I did want to go over because sometimes people might get questions from landowners on this. It's not, it's not common to run into outside of CRP probably. So PLS is a measure of expressing seed quality. So seed differs in purity and in germination, and we only really want to plant good, viable seed that has the potential to germinate. So PLS is a measure of the seed's capacity to germinate per 1 pound weight of seed. And I say pound, it could be expressed in pounds per acre or ounces per acre. And then that's calibrated to seeds per square foot, which is really what we use to determine seeding rates. And PLS is calculated by multiplying the percent purity by the total germination percentage. So I think of it as the percent pure multiplied by the percent alive. And then part of developing a seed mixture and assessing site conditions is to determine if we need a temporary cover or a companion crop. When might those be beneficial? So I'll briefly touch on both of them. Ideally, land conversion is happening within 12 months of signing a contract, if possible. But there are situations that call for extensions. So, temporary cover during the first year can be used in a few situations, commonly when there's chemical residual. So that's going to affect our new planting. So prior to planting, we just need to make sure to check what herbicides were used on the crop so we know about potential carryover and what damage that could do to our seeding. So for example, like some herbicides like atrazine, they can have carryover up to like 2 years or something. So definitely something to consider. And then by comparison, companion crops are used to reduce erosion on critical sites, so maybe on some hilly sites, and to suppress weeds. So they won't outcompete the slower growing prairie plants. We stick a lot of native ones like Canada wild rye, side oats, grandma in. Oats is a common one as well. With oats, it's just important to note that those need to be clipped off prior to seeding out. So this is pretty important to stress to landowners a couple times if possible, that adequate site prep is really crucial for successful native plantings. It's just a step where being thorough is going to pay dividends. And there's only really one chance that we get to do site prep well. In fact, the factor responsible for most failures with these restorations is just poor weed control. So this is the phase where we're controlling weeds, making sure that we're planting into a clean slate. So the key, we're removing any perennial weeds with herbicide, and we're firming up the seed bed, making sure that the seeds make contact with bare mineral soil. So we want to make sure that we're getting good seed to soil contact. Crop fields are ideal. Vegetation removal isn't necessary. The crop comes off. They also require very little seed bed preparation, but sometimes crop residue has to be removed. It's why soybean fields are really the ideal starting place for any restoration. Soybean fields are just essentially ready to seed into. If we're planting in the spring following that harvest, a round of herbicide is going to be necessary. Spray off any annual weeds prior to planting. But for the most part, a lot of our CRP projects, they're really good site prep because we're planting into existing cropland. And maybe we can even plan ahead and have the landowner plant soybeans. But let's say we're planting into a fallow field or a hay field or something like that. So these projects are going to require a little bit more investment in cost and effort on the front end. Because landowners, they need to remove any vegetation, any residue that's on the soil surface, either by grazing, haying, or burning. And then they need to spray off any vegetation with herbicide. So kill any remaining vegetation. And especially focusing on any aggressive perennial weeds. So like brome or Canada thistle are some of the ones that we commonly run into. multiple rounds of herbicide are going to be necessary for those. And I won't dig too deep into herbicides or chemicals, but just a note that broad spectrum is something we want to use something non-selective, right? We don't want to, for at least these initial spray offs, we just want something that's not going to target one plant group, but it's really just going to burn all vegetation down. There's also organic site prep options for organic farms. These options usually require a significantly longer weed control stage. There's some additional challenges with these, but it's an option. And then one note on cultivation. Sometimes landowners are keen to, till up the soil, and there's definitely a time and place for that, but making sure that landowners are adhering to technical service recommendations, just because cultivation is likely to bring up any weed seed from below the seed bed, or like deep within the seed bed. It's just going to raise it up and then allow those seeds to germinate. So typically we want to avoid it if possible. So moving on to the next stage, planting itself. There's several methods of planting. I'll get into those a bit. But first, just one point about native seeds. Native seeds should be planted with equipment designed to handle different size seeds. So it's somewhat specialized equipment compared to, our standard ag practices. Looking at these seeds in the upper right here, there's a whole mixture of them. Some are light and fluffy, like big blue stem, Indian grass. Those are, they've got that little fluff on them. Some are smooth and hard and very small, like switchgrass. Some are large, some are irregular in shape. It's a real mixture, and that can make for some uneven flow when you use standard seeding equipment. So it's really critical that our producers understand the need for specialized equipment. As for methods, no-till drills are probably the more common method since they can just plant directly into light stubble. Here's some photos of some drills down at the bottom. They've got some special features for handling native seed. So they've got like an additional seed box for mixing and metering the seed. And you can kind of see in the upper right, that mixing process. You can see the carrier. It looks like they use sawdust. So those are kind of the workings with those drills. The other option is to broadcast or to scatter the seed. It's an option for sites where maybe a drill isn't feasible, or if landowners don't have access to equipment to pull a drill, for example. And broadcasting can be done by hand or mechanically. So native plantings can be seeded in the spring, late fall, or winter. Really, spring is the traditional time to do these seedings. They favor the native grasses a little bit more than the forbs and legumes, but if conditions aren't ideal to plant in the spring, fall is also another good option. And those fall plantings do favor the forbs and legumes over grasses. And these fall ones are typically called dormant seedings, so they just occur after the growing season. And then finally, there are late winter seedings. Those occur in late February, early March timeframe. They're not common in Wisconsin just because we've got too much snow during those times. So after a prairie is seeded, there is some aftercare needed to ensure good establishment. So in the first 2 years after planting, there's going to be this flush of annual and biennial weeds. And those are going to grow much faster than our slow growing natives. So a lot of our native prairie plants, they take those first few years to really build a lot of below ground root mass. So they're investing in their below ground structures and developing quite slowly. And this is when our prairie plants are at risk from being overtopped and outcompeted by weeds. And that's why we want to see repeated mowings. Those might be necessary throughout this establishment phase. For example, in the first year, it's recommended to mow to a height of like 8 inches once the vegetation reaches about a foot in height. Generally, this is at about 30-day intervals after planting. It's also important to use equipment that won't smother the vegetation, or if you have to use equipment that it doesn't feather or chop the vegetation very well, just making sure that those clippings are then removed just because we don't want to squash the seedlings. And then the second year after planting, that's really when, we should just be doing routine evaluations to see if a spot mowing is needed. Because it can take up to like 2 to 5 years for a prairie to be fully established. Typically, this occurs by year 3. And a great phrase to tell producers is the saying, I'm sure we've all heard it, first year a prairie sleeps, second year it creeps, third year it leaps. The photo on the left, that's a year 1 planting. You can see the sparse seedlings, the weed competition a little bit, trying to poke up. And then the right is a year 2 planting. So you can see that transition. You can really notice a difference. It's quite a good looking prairie. It's full of prairie species that are very quick to establish. You've got black-eyed Susan is the yellow one, bergamot, Canada wild rye. This photo contrast, it does demonstrate that, patience is a virtue when it comes to prairie plantings. And I think that's a big takeaway that hopefully landowners walk away with, that prairies are worth that initial investment, in the planning stage, in making sure they do adequate site prep, and those initial maintenance mows. And then once established, prairies are a fairly low maintenance ecosystem. They're quite resilient, not no maintenance, but low maintenance once established. But it is worth that upfront effort. So I'll just briefly touch on long-term management. I'll leave further discussion for that for future talks, but just quickly wanted to distinguish between this and post-establishment management. So in the long-term management, that's really when that primary nesting season will be in effect for any of our planned maintenance activities. All right, and then finally, this is just a good summary of some prairie establishment timeline. And it's a good tool to give to landowners if they're doing a spring planting. It covers site prep in year 1, when that planting deadline is, that, the fact that weed management is going to have to be done during the establishment period. And it does go over some guidance on year 2 and 3, how to know when to spot clip, that sort of thing, with real emphasis on the fact that reassessment is going to be needed throughout the whole establishment phase. That is it. So now we'll take some time for questions here. I'll stop presenting.
Just quick before questions start pouring in, Maddie, I was able to post both the Farm Bill biologist contact map and the establishment timeline, kind of that last slide that you had in the chat.
Okay, thanks, Scott.
Maybe we need an icebreaker question to get us going. So I'll pull from my desk. Weed abatement, you talked about quite a bit. I'm wondering do you ever see sites, Maddie, where they don't need that first year mowing?
Yeah, that is a great question, Scott. And I think I've been on one, recently. We have a landowner in Dunn County where I don't even know if it was for CRP or if it was an equip planting, but yeah, definitely just phenomenal site prep, great weather conditions. There's a slew of factors that go into what makes the rapidity of prairie establish. But most certainly have seen sites where not a single mow was required in that first year. So that's a great point to bring up, Scott, that we've got the standard approach for the success of these plantings is, mow that first year. But that's not necessarily the case. We're seeing a lot of, research to show that, maybe that's not the most critical stage in these establishments. I don't know if you want to touch more on that, Scott, if you've had any findings.
You nailed it, unless there's other questions related to that one. There is a question that came in the chat. I don't, Maddie, can you see that chat?
Yeah, so
Okay.
how long into the establishment timeline does it take to know if the planting did not establish and needs to be redone? That's a great question. Something that when I was doing these third-year establishment checks this past year, and I know a lot of other farm bills were running into this too, that we have a year 3 establishment check, right? So that's a status review when we're typically expecting to see that a prairie has fully established. So to answer your question, typically year 3, that's how long into the establishment timeline. But it is variable depending on the site. And, we've had 3 very dry years. So potentially landowners were doing what they were supposed to and maybe mowing, but maybe that was a little bit detrimental in some severe dry conditions. So it's a little bit more complicated, and I think we ran into not a lot of failures, thankfully, but some failed plantings where maybe it's just going to take a little bit more time for that prairie to establish. So I think any from year 1 to year 5 could a prairie be established, which is it's not a clear answer, but typically year 3.
I have a question for you. I think a lot of times we'll see producers, we'll see naturally forbs be outcompeted on a stand, throughout the 10 to 15 year life cycle. We'll see that show up in a status review and a producer who may be interested in getting some more forbs out there. What kind of recommendation would you make for a producer who wanted to get some more flowers on a stand that has become dominated by grasses?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And one that, we also might, whoever is doing the long-term management talk might touch on that too in more detail. There are a few options. I think burning is a fantastic ecological tool that we can use for these prairies, and maybe a combination of burning and interseeding to really enhance that forb component. But I was talking with our NRCS state biologist, Steve Burchins, and some of these native grasses, they are very dominant and they really have outcompeted. So potentially even herbicide if it's really, really strong and dense and a producer really wants to take over some of those grasses with forbs, that can be an option too. But I don't know, maybe Scott has some other feedback on that.
Maddie, you hit the 2 big ones, and just an overall idea is these prairie systems love disturbance. And so it's the lack of disturbance that tends to push them to that monotypic, kind of 1 or 2 grass dominated systems. So any type of disturbance, especially when we're talking about prairies outside of CRP, grazing and, any kind of trampling or haying can be effective. There's a lot of different types of disturbance. Mowing is one that comes to mind, but it's all got to be timed right. Even with your burns, like you could burn it at the wrong time of the year and get more grass to come, like push it more towards that monotypic. So it gets back to that art form that you were talking about earlier too, versus the science a little bit as well. So a lot of factors. Bottom line, disturbance is needed.
Awesome. Well, any other questions? Pop them in the chat. Anything else?
I think I'll stop the recording.